My name is Bobbi Ullinger. I identify as a non-binary, gender-fluid trans woman. My pronouns are her, she, just like the chocolate bar. And before I start, I want you to just take a deep breath and look around at this magnificent space. It is absolutely gorgeous. I love old churches. When we start to look at Scripture through a clear lens, a whole new understanding reveals itself. We begin to see affirmation of the LGBTQ community, such as in Isaiah 56, where we're told that despite what we have heard all of our lives, we have a place at the table and in the church. In Acts 8, when Philip tells the Ethiopian eunuch, a sexual minority that is very closely paralleled to today's LGBTQ community, that despite what they were probably told at the temple, that they are indeed a child of God worthy of baptism. And then there are the coming out stories. Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt. Esther revealing herself as a Jew to the king. And then, of course, that greatest coming out of all stories is on Easter morning, Jesus coming out of the tomb. And then again, he has to come out again later to his apostles, where Thomas had to see and touch to believe. But for me, one of the most captivating coming out stories is the coming out of Lazarus. You see, Lazarus was not a prophet. He was not royalty. He wasn't a god. He was a disciple of Jesus, but he was not one of the chosen 12 apostles. He was just an ordinary guy. But he did have a supportive family. He had two sisters, Mary and Martha, both of whom are mentioned in other stories within the Gospels. And it was the love of these two women that they had for each other, for their brother Lazarus, and for Jesus, that makes Lazarus special. It was the pleas of Mary and Martha that led to the intervention of Jesus and set the stage for Lazarus' coming out. And if we are fortunate as Lazarus to have a supportive family like his sisters, and an ally of Jesus, which we all are, our coming out is so much more likely to have a happy ending. I suspect that every one of us in this room has a coming out story, whether coming out as gay, bi, trans, pan, coming out as your whole self, or coming out as an ally, or the loving, supportive parent of a queer kid. Our coming out stories are many, and while they all have some similarities, they are each unique. Some have happy endings. Some are still waiting for their happy endings. Some of us came out in our own time. Some of us were outed. Many of us have had to come out over and over again. But each of our stories all have us revealing something about ourselves. I am what many of you might consider a late bloomer. I did not start to come to understand myself or what it meant to be transgender until I was in my late 40s. And I was in my early 50s before I thought it was even possible to embrace myself as trans. Oh, I knew from an early age that I was different from the other kids around me. But for most of my life, I didn't have the language to describe, even to myself, what it meant to be different in the way that I felt. And it was not until my wife and I had been married for almost 30 years that I had the courage to come out to her. And that was in 2007. She was the very first person that I ever talked to about this. And she graciously joined me as we started our journey to understand who I am and what this revelation means to us, to our marriage and family, and to our faith. Shortly after our marriage in 1978, Kathy and I decided that we wanted to raise our family in faith. I had grown up in the Catholic Church, Kathy in the Southern Baptist tradition. But the only church that was within walking distance of our on-campus college apartment was a Presbyterian church. And there we found a lot of good people. Back then, it was a very progressive congregation with a huge heart for social justice. In the decades that followed, I would be ordained as an elder, and I headed up many projects, not the least of which was designing and installing the audio, video, and lighting systems in the sanctuary. I think that my fingerprints were all over that church, from the top of the organ loft down to the sump in the bottom of the elevator shaft. And I was in all of them. Kathy was a deacon and taught Sunday school for several years. I led Bible studies, and we both had sung in the choir at one time or another. We had found a great place to raise our 5 kids. Yes, we were that family that was the first one there Sunday mornings and the last one to leave several nights of the week. But by the time that I was ready to come out, some 30 years later, there was a new pastor, and the congregation had changed. The pastor at the time, a good friend, the pastor at the time, a good friend, and when I first came out to him as trans, the conversation was quite hopeful. He seemed supportive, and he told me that the fact that I am trans would have little or no effect on our friendship. Up to this time, I was still mostly closeted and just beginning my social transition. But then one day at lunch, I told him that I felt called to some kind of ministry to the LGBTQ community, probably to the college kids that were right across the street from the church. His demeanor changed, especially when I said that in order to make this ministry work, I would have to come out completely, publicly and to the congregation. In trying to figure out the best way for me to come out to the congregation without being inundated with dozens of questions from 100 individual persons, I first submitted an article to the weekly church newsletter. It was promptly rejected by the pastor for being inappropriate. When I was asked if I could use the church's email list to send this message out to individuals with only my signature to it, nope, that would not be appropriate. When I asked if I could teach an adult Sunday school class or a Wednesday evening class, nope, same answer, that was inappropriate. My efforts to come out to the congregation, every one of my requests was denied. So one Sunday morning, after sitting in my car, clutching the steering wheel in the parking lot and having a huge debate with myself, I walked into the sanctuary wearing a denim skirt, high heels, and my best makeup. And I sat down at the soundboard to make preparations for the upcoming service. At one point, I stood up and turned to say good morning to the woman that ran the computer for the slides in the video. She was so busy doing her preparations that she didn't even notice how I was dressed or what I looked like. But then I noticed one of the elders up in the chancel filling the candles with oil. And he'd squint back at me and fill a little bit. He'd squint back and he'd fill a little bit, squint back and fill a little bit more. And finally, after several minutes of this, he came walking back to where I was sitting at the soundboard, and he had this kind of half grin on his face. He said, "I'm shocked, absolutely shocked, but it explains so much." It soon became apparent that you could split the congregation into three parts. Those that were under the age of 35 or thereabouts had no problem with me coming out. Those that were older than 60 or thereabouts were, for the most part, totally affirming. But it was that group in the middle that just absolutely refused to try to understand. Unfortunately, it was that group that had the deepest pockets. And it was also the group in which the pastor was. Within a couple of weeks, I was told that I was no longer allowed to operate the sound system. Yeah, that sound system that I designed and installed, despite being a professional sound tech. A meeting was held between the pastor, 3 of the elders, and myself to decide what I was and was no longer allowed to do. Conversation went something like this. "Can I be an usher?" "No, that wouldn't be appropriate." "Can I serve coffee and cookies after the service?" "Yeah, you could probably do that." "Could I get back into the choir and sing in the choir?" "Yeah, that would probably be okay." But then that knife that was already in my heart was twisted when one of the elders, who I had thought was a good friend, said, "But you should understand, if you were to join the choir, half the choir would quit." At the end of that conversation, I told them that I was not so much concerned about my feelings as I was with that young, closeted queer kid in the pews, seeing how I was treated and what that would do to them. The reply that I got was, "Well, statistically, that's not very likely." After that meeting, I went out to my car and I cried. I was never told to leave. I was never told why I was suddenly a second-class citizen. I was never even told that being transgender was wrong. But every Sunday morning, I would hear from the pulpit, "Everyone is welcome here." Or, "We encourage everyone to use their talents and gifts in this church." And all the time, knowing that those words did not apply to me. Kathy felt it too. People would suddenly get very quiet when she walked into a room, and they weren't as willing to talk to her. Or they would ask her questions about me, personal questions that she was not ready to answer. She wanted to walk away right then and there, but I was determined I was going to stick it out, hoping to change hearts and minds. But I think knowing the inevitable, we started looking at other churches. After a year of leaving Sunday services, either crying my eyes out or in a fit of rage, we walked away. The other churches that we checked out were all lovely, welcoming and affirming, but while they had a few LGB members, usually maybe an older white gay person, I would have been the only out transgender person. And after what we had just been through, I just was not ready to be the first. But that Sunday in the early spring of 2016, that I first walked into the church in Silver Lake, the person greeting people as they entered the church was a trans woman. Love you, Joni. I had known Brad, the pastor at the time, from when I had done some work at his previous church. But he had only known me as Rob from before my transition, so he didn't quite recognize me. It took a few minutes. But he quickly introduced me to some members of True Colors, the LGBTQ ministry team that had just recently been formed. And within a few minutes, I was invited to the Oscar watch party that was taking place at the pastor's house the following week. It did not take long for us to feel welcome. I was urged to get involved using my skills with the church's technology, and Kathy and I were welcomed into the Silver Lake family. They had their first gay wedding a few months before we arrived. But Kathy and I attended our first gay wedding about 2 years later at Silver Lake. It was at that wedding, dancing in the fellowship hall, that I first saw Kathy re-blossom like a flower that had been dormant over the winter. Prior to that, she had always been very supportive. But dancing in our fellowship hall among our family, she felt comfortable enough to let down her guard, to hold my hand, and to embrace me in public for the first time. While most churches look forward to Easter and Christmas as their most important holidays, with the most planning and where their attendance is usually highest, at Silver Lake, we like to say we have 3 major holidays. We have Easter, we have Christmas, but then on the last Sunday each June, we have Pride Sunday. Silver Lake has had a booth at Akron Pride for as long as there has been an Akron Pride. Last year, we gave away over 1,000 bottles of water with no strings attached, no expectations. But our mantra, as we handed out these ice-cold bottles of water in the 90-degree August heat, was hydrate, 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 hydrate or die straight. We are getting ready to have a settled pastor. Our interim pastor just left. Today was his last Sunday. And in the effort to carry that on, they did a survey of the congregation to help, and found that almost half of the congregation, 43.7%, identify as something other than straight. And the thing that's amazing to me is 20% identify as something other than cisgender. We had, I think, 5 or 6 trans people in service this morning that I know of. Kathy and I arrived at Silver Lake as spiritual refugees, looking for some place that would just accept us. What we found was family that loves us unconditionally, nurtures us, and feeds our souls. And almost every Sunday we see new faces, queer faces, and we try to show them the same extravagant welcome that Kathy and I received when we so badly needed it. I sincerely hope that your coming out story, whether it's coming out as an individual or coming out as a congregation, as being open and affirming, has that same happy ending that our coming out story has. I truly believe, though, that our coming out story is just a glimpse of what is possible when love is louder. Thank you, and happy Pride.